This man was richer than Jeff Bezos, but he also taught the secrets of Stoic happiness. He was a billionaire, a politician, and a philosopher, but he was also accused of being a hypocrite and a fraud. How did he defend his financial philosophy, and what can you learn from him today? Seneca was a Roman statesman, playwright, and tutor of Emperor Nero. He was also a prolific writer and a prominent figure in the Stoic movement, which taught that the only thing that matters in life is virtue, or living according to reason and nature. In this video, we will examine how Seneca applied this philosophy to his own financial situation, which was often marked by extremes of fortune and misfortune. We will draw on his writings, such as On the Happy Life, On Benefits, and Letters to Lucilius, to understand his perspective on wealth, poverty, and happiness. Do you want to learn how to achieve true wealth and happiness? Do you wonder how some of the most successful people in history managed their finances and lifestyles? Do you want to discover the secrets of Stoic philosophy and how it can help you live a better life? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you are in the right place. Stay tuned and get ready to learn from the master of Stoic wealth. Wealth is indifferent. One of the core principles of Stoicism is that there are only two kinds of things in the world: things that are under our control and things that are not. The only thing that is under our control is our own mind, our own judgments, opinions, and actions. Everything else, such as our body, our health, our reputation, our relationships, and our wealth, is not under our control, and therefore not up to us. The Stoics called the things that are under our control goods, and the things that are not under our control indifferents. Goods are the only things that have intrinsic value and moral significance, and they are the only things that can make us happy and virtuous. Indifferents, on the other hand, have no intrinsic value or moral significance, and they cannot make us happy or virtuous. They are neither good nor bad, but neutral. They are only tools that can be used for good or evil, depending on the character and intention of the user. Wealth is one of the indifferents, according to the Stoics. It is neither good nor bad, but indifferent. It has no value or meaning in itself, but only in relation to how we use it and how we relate to it. Wealth does not guarantee happiness, nor does poverty prevent it. The only thing that matters is how we use what we have and how we relate to it. Seneca argues that wealth is not a good, but an indifferent, in his letter to Paulinus. He writes, "Wealth is the slave of the wise man and the master of the fool." He means that a wise person can use wealth as a means to achieve virtuous ends, such as helping others, learning, and cultivating oneself. But a foolish person becomes enslaved by wealth and lets it dictate his actions, desires, and emotions. He becomes greedy, arrogant, and restless, always wanting more and never being satisfied. Seneca warns that wealth can be a source of trouble and misery if we attach ourselves to it and depend on it for our happiness. Seneca also illustrates this point with a famous story from Greek mythology, the story of Midas. Midas was a king who wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. His wish was granted, but he soon realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He could not eat, drink, or hug his daughter because everything he touched turned to gold. He begged the gods to take away his curse, and they did. But he learned a valuable lesson, that wealth is not a blessing, but a burden, if we do not know how to use it wisely and moderately. Seneca concludes his letter by saying, "The wise man is content with himself. He does not need anything outside himself to make him happy. He does not need wealth, but he can use it if he has it. He does not reject wealth, but he does not love it either. He is indifferent to wealth as he is to everything else that is not under his control. Poverty is preferable. Another principle of Stoicism is that we should live according to nature, both our own nature as rational and social beings, and the nature of the universe as a whole. The Stoics believed that the universe is governed by a divine reason, or logos, that orders everything in a rational and harmonious way. They also believed that we have a spark of this logos within us, and that we can align ourselves with it by following our reason and our nature. The Stoics argued that living according to nature means living with simplicity and self-sufficiency, without depending on external things for our happiness or well-being. They also argued that living with simplicity and self-sufficiency means living with less rather than with more, and that poverty, or having the bare necessities, is preferable to wealth, or having more than we need, for several reasons. First, poverty is more natural and more in harmony with the Stoic ideal of simplicity and self-sufficiency. The Stoics admired the examples of Socrates, Diogenes, and Cato, who lived with very little and were content with what they had. They also criticized the examples of Croesus, Midas, and Nero, who had everything and were miserable with what they had. They claimed that poverty is closer to the original and natural state of humanity. Before the invention of money, luxury, and civilization corrupted our desires and expectations. They also claimed that poverty is more conducive to the exercise of our reason and our virtue, as it frees us from the distractions and complications that wealth brings. Second, poverty is more conducive to virtue and happiness, as it frees us from the temptations and anxieties that wealth brings. The Stoics warned that wealth can make us greedy, arrogant, and restless, always wanting more and never being satisfied. They also warned that wealth can make us fearful, insecure, and paranoid, always worrying about losing what we have and protecting what we have. They argued that wealth can corrupt our character and our judgment and make us forget our true values and goals. They also argued that wealth can alienate us from ourselves and from others and make us unhappy and miserable. Third, poverty is more beneficial for our moral education and spiritual growth, as it teaches us to be content with what we have, to appreciate the value of the things that money cannot buy, and to practice gratitude, generosity, and compassion. The Stoics advised us to practice voluntary poverty, or to live as if we were poor, even if we are not, as a way of training ourselves to be indifferent to wealth and to be prepared for any change of fortune. They also advised us to practice gratitude for what we have, and to recognize that everything we have is a gift from the universe or from God that we do not deserve and that we cannot keep. They also advised us to practice generosity and compassion and to share what we have with others, especially those who are in need, as a way of expressing our gratitude and our humanity. Seneca praises poverty as a better choice than wealth in his essay on the happy life. He writes, "It is the mind that creates our wealth, and this is as great for him who possesses nothing as for him who possesses all things. For he is poor, not who has little, but who hankers after more." He means that happiness does not depend on the amount of money or possessions we have, but on the state of our mind and soul. He suggests that living with less can help us cultivate a more peaceful, content, and virtuous mind that is not disturbed by external circumstances, but finds joy in the inner goods of wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control. One of the most common objections to Seneca's financial philosophy is that he was a hypocrite and a paradox monger who preached one thing and practiced another. Seneca was one of the richest men in Rome who amassed a fortune from his political and business activities, and who lived in luxury and opulence. How could he claim to be a Stoic who valued simplicity and self-sufficiency, and who advocated poverty and detachment from wealth? This objection is not new. Seneca faced it from his contemporaries and later commentators, who accused him of being inconsistent and insincere. Some of them even suggested that he was a fraud and a charlatan who used his philosophy as a cover for his greed and ambition. How can we defend Seneca from this criticism? How can we reconcile his views on wealth and poverty with his own financial success and social status? The answer is that Seneca was not inconsistent or insincere, but rather pragmatic and flexible. He did not reject wealth altogether, but rather used it wisely and moderately, without being attached to it or corrupted by it. He also did not neglect his social and political duties, but rather fulfilled them with integrity and benevolence, without being compromised by them or seduced by them. He also did not ignore the realities and challenges of living in a complex and imperfect world, but rather adapted to them with skill and resilience, without being overwhelmed by them or defeated by them. Seneca was well aware of the tension between his philosophy and his practice, and he addressed it in several of his writings. He admitted that he was not a perfect Stoic, but a human being with flaws and weaknesses, who was still learning and striving to improve himself. He also argued that he was not a traitor to his principles, but a follower of them, who applied them to his specific situation and circumstances. He claimed that he did not love wealth, but only used it as a tool and a gift that he could easily give up or lose without regret. He also claimed that he did not abuse his power, but only exercised it as a duty and a service that he could perform with honor and kindness. He also claimed that he did not fear adversity, but only faced it as a test and an opportunity that he could overcome with courage and wisdom. Seneca's financial philosophy is not a contradiction, but a compatibility between wealth and wisdom, between poverty and happiness, between virtue and fortune. He shows us that it is possible to be rich and wise, to be poor and happy, to be virtuous and fortunate, as long as we follow our reason and our nature, and as long as we are indifferent to the things that are not under our control. He shows us that it is not the amount of money or possessions we have that matters, but the state of our mind and soul. He shows us that it is not the external things that make us happy, but the internal things that make us virtuous. He shows us that it is not what we have, but what we do with what we have that defines who we are. So, we explored Seneca's financial philosophy and how he applied the Stoic principles of detachment, moderation, and self-reliance to his own wealth and lifestyle. We learned that Seneca did not condemn money, but rather the excessive desire and misuse of it. He taught us that the true value of wealth lies not in how much we have, but in how well we use it for the common good and our own virtue. He also showed us how to balance the pursuit of external goods with the cultivation of inner peace and happiness. But how can we apply these lessons to our own lives? How can we train our minds to crave doing hard things instead of seeking comfort and pleasure? How can we get ahead of 99% of people, not by competing with them, but by improving ourselves? These are the questions that we will answer in the next 2 videos now on your screen. Stay tuned and subscribe to our channel for more philosophical insights and practical tips. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. Seneca.